Principal Gallagher's Lesbian Lover is the second episode of the third season of 2.5 Men. This is directed by Halvorson, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I talk about what happens and share some thoughts along the way. And it starts off with Alan at the chiropractor's, and he sees a patient called Mr. Dunlop. Mr. Dunlop is very, very tall, and he ends up falling on Alan. And I couldn't remember what happened in this episode. I could remember the main point of the narrative, but I couldn't remember the intro. And when Mr. Dunlop fell on Alan, that sounded like, or felt like, it would have been the joke, that's it. And then we would have had the intro. But they went one step further and had Alan's phone ring. It's Judith. He needs to pick up Jake. Alan phones Charlie. Charlie doesn't want to answer. And I like the fact that they kind of pushed that a little bit further and got a little bit more out of the scenario. Obviously, that's kind of launching into the main point of the narrative, which we find out straight after, because Alan does eventually manage to go and pick up Jake, and Jake has been suspended. He's been sent home from school for misbehaving, and this is the bit that I did remember very well. He drew a picture of a girl in his class called Barbara Schmidt, and interesting surname, Schmidt. I won't say why in case you haven't seen anything from later seasons of 2.5 Men, but definitely an interesting name choice there. And Barbara is a lot more developed than the other girls in her class, and Jake drew this picture of her with the name Boobra written above it. I have to say, that's horrendous, that's horrific, but when they're saying it in the episode, kind of funny. Obviously not a behaviour that I condone, but it was kind of clever. Jake was actually even more clever than this, and there was a bit that actually made me laugh out loud because Alan understandably sends Jake to his room, and Alan's talking to Charlie, and Jake responds to something, and Jake should be in his room, he shouldn't be able to hear, so Alan tells him close the door, and then a couple of minutes later, or even a couple of seconds later, Jake responds to something else that Alan and Charlie were saying. And Alan says, "I thought I told you to close the door." And Jake says, without realising it, I don't think he realised what he was saying. He said, "It is closed," and stepped into view. To be fair, Alan didn't specify close your door and make sure you're on the other side of it. And I found that to be very amusing. Alan is still upset with Charlie for the fact that Charlie didn't answer the phone when he needed him. And Charlie says, "What can I do to make it up to you?" And Alan has an idea. And actually, I think Charlie had a lot of fun with the narrative in this one. Not to begin with, though, because Alan says that his receptionist at the chiropractor's is actually unavailable tomorrow, so Charlie can fill in for the receptionist, just take the calls and make them rebook appointments for later on. And Charlie has to get up very, very early, and he's not very happy about this. But we have a delightful scene where Alan goes to wake up Charlie. Charlie's not in his bed, and this didn't play out the way I thought it was going to be fair. I thought that Charlie had managed to get up early and he was proving Alan wrong, and that he was ready to go to work and everything was going to be great. It turns out he hadn't actually been to bed. He'd been in somebody else's bed, but he hadn't been in his own bed. So that didn't go the way I was expecting. We have a great moment with Berta, where the picture was on the fridge. The picture of Barbara that Jake drew was on the fridge, and Alan shows it to Berta. And once Berta and Jake are alone in the kitchen, she approaches him and she says to him, "So, you like making fun of girls with big boobs?" And Jake doesn't know what to do with his eyes. He kind of looks down at Berta's chest and looks back up to her and just says, "Not anymore." And I thought it was quite a delightful exchange. We then get the car ride with Alan and Charlie, and something I've mentioned before, and I'm sure I'll mention it again, is that in general, I think cars can be such boring locations. I hate road trip films, generally speaking, of course, and I just don't find them to be that interesting. But in 2.5 Men, the car rides usually are really great, and we get so much comedy out of them. And we do with Charlie. He's not loving the slow traffic, but he keeps getting a bright idea, and he does a little click every time he gets a bright idea, which I thought was adorable. And eventually They get to the office. Alan then goes on his own to see the principal, and Barbara's mother comes in, Mrs. Schmidt, and she's played by Stephanie Erb. And when she takes off her jacket, all we see, well, I say all we see, the eyes are drawn to her chest area, and it's clear that Barbara takes after her mother. And Alan makes a complete fool of himself. He puts his foot in his mouth many times, and I was feeling like he can't come back from this. He's gone too far. He said too many ludicrous and potentially offensive things to her. And then when he said, here a breast, there a breast, everywhere a breast, I knew that there was no coming back from this. And I'll conclude this part of the story first of all, then I'll go back to Charlie. After a pretty well-written exchange, brilliant performances from both Alan and, well, from John Cryer and Stephanie Erb, they decide to let the principal decide what happens with Jake's punishment, and the principal comes out, and she is also quite a larger-chested woman, and Alan realises that he has absolutely no hope in this situation. Charlie is having a lot of hope, because while he's at the chiropractor's, he did what I think I would have done in that situation as well. First of all, when he first sits down and he's on his own, the first thing he does is pick up a pencil and stick it in the electric sharpener. Absolutely the first thing I would do as well. And then a woman comes in looking for the masseuse position, and Charlie, although he has no authority to hire her, he kind of does hire her. And the next thing we know, when Alan comes back to the chiropractor's, it's busy. It's very, very busy. And there have been a lot of happy endings, as Alan had claimed. And needless to say, Alan's not very happy. In fact, I think the word he used was brothel. Charlie had turned his chiropractor's practice into a brothel. Alan had not had the best of days, but honestly I found it to be a very, very funny episode. There's a lot of comedy in this. There are also some really important discussions, of course, about not making fun of girls or women with large breasts, and I think it did a really good job of showing that while retaining the comedy, because obviously if something's funny, you're more likely to pay attention to it, to remember it, and every single time there was a negative comment made about larger breasts, somebody shot it down, whether that's Alan giving Jake into trouble for the boob wrap picture, or Berta making sure Jake knew that was not okay. Every time Alan opened his mouth around Mrs. Schmidt, she made sure that everything he said was not acceptable. And I think they did a really great job with delivering that message. And we get some great comedy, great performances. Charlie was just fabulous. I thought Charlie's enthusiasm, I don't agree with the methods of finding happiness, but his enthusiasm once he was at the chiropractor's office, even when he was sitting at the desk and just kind of fiddling with everything and answering the phone. I don't think I mentioned this, but he answered the phone twice to Alan without saying what he was meant to say. And it was just, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very well done, and definitely a really great episode.